As you know, Great Britain left the European Union in 2020, and the economic boom is a long time coming, and bureaucracy is increasing. Only limiting migration works, but differently than expected. And 4 years ago, the time had come. The opponents of the European Union belted out, "Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves." That's one of the most popular patriotic songs on the British Isles. On the night of January 31st to February 1st in 2020, Great Britain became the first country in the history of the EU to leave the Union. It was the result of the Brexit referendum in which 51.89% of the Brits voted leave 4 years earlier. And for the supporters it was clear. The boom could only be achieved with Brexit. And the Brexiteers hoped for an economic upswing through the transition to free trade, the elimination of EU regulations and the better control of their immigration of low-skilled workers. That was said by economist and international economic policy expert Klaus-Jürgen Gern from the Institute for the World Economy in Kiel. And as I said, the Brexiteers belted out the second line of the chorus even louder. Britons will never be slaves. But has Britain freed itself from the chains of alleged bullying from Brussels? Will there now be more free trade, less bureaucracy, lower taxes, and more controlled migration? Well, the United Kingdom is the mother of free trade. The legendary fighter for free trade, Richard Cobden, dreamed of the small rainy island in the Atlantic in the 19th century. Through free trade, humanity becomes a family, and man with man freely shares the fruits of his labor in a brotherly manner. Well, many supporters of Brexit hope that leaving the EU would bring a return to this time when free trade was the British Islands' economic recipe for success. At first glance, the Brexiteers say that they keep their promise. Since leaving the EU, 71 free trade agreements have come into force. However, a second look reveals a less impressive balance. 68 of the 71 agreements are so-called rollover agreements. This means that they are identical to the agreements that the British had before they left the EU internal market. Further agreements were only concluded with 3 countries. One of them was Japan. The deal builds on the previous EU-Japan agreement. London and Tokyo have only made a few additional agreements, for example, in the digital sector, in data agreements, and for the fintech sector. But in other areas, it even got worse for the British than it was before. And then we have New Zealand. Since May 23, 100% of British exports to New Zealand have been exempt from import duties, while the reverse is 97%. However, the rollover of an EU agreement was not possible because Brussels itself had not yet concluded a bilateral agreement with New Zealand. But that's not an issue anymore either. And then we had Australia. Since May 23, 98% of British exports to Australia have been exempt from import duties, and the reverse is 99%. As with New Zealand, there was previously no agreement between the EU and Australia. The inclusion of Great Britain in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP for short, received great media coverage. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is one of the largest free trade regions in the world. A good 12% of the global gross domestic product, or GDP, and around 500 million people. It economically connects the countries of Australia, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and Brunei. But Great Britain will not join until this year. And the USA left the agreement in 2017, at the time under President Donald Trump. And as a result, the CPTPP has lost its relevance. After all, observers expect a breakthrough in the negotiations with India in 2025. And Brexit is therefore not a free trade success story. Proponents of Brexit not only promised a Britain that was open to trade, but also a more competitive one, with lower taxes and fewer contributions to the EU. The lane tanker Great Britain was supposed to become the Singapore on the Thames. According to Stephen Davies, it didn't happen. The scientist is head of education at the renowned liberal think tank and research institute of Economic Affairs in London. That's a 5-minute walk from Westminster Parliament. And for him, Singapore on the Thames has always been just a wet dream of liberal economists. Fewer taxes and duties are important steps to help the British economy, but Brexit didn't help, because most Brexit voters didn't care about economic reasons. Only a maximum of 20% of voters represented a liberal vision of Brexit until today. Most voted to leave for nationalist reasons. The British government, whether Conservative or Social Democrat, has always been a supporter of a larger state in recent years. And Davies tells the EU has not forced them to keep increasing government consumption. National debt is at record levels, and that is a national decision. That's why it's no surprise that the level of taxes and duties remained high even after Brexit. In an international comparison by the Tax Foundation, Great Britain has even lost competitiveness. The authors Daniel Bunn and Alex Menken write in their study that Great Britain has allowed super depreciation for machinery to expire, and the government has increased corporate tax from 19% to 25% for large companies. And the author's conclusion is, in the tax competition ranking among 38 nations, Great Britain has slipped from 27th to 30th place. And also take back control was the popular rallying cry of former Prime Minister and Brexit supporter Boris Johnson. That's a clear rejection of the Brussels bureaucracy. Many people hoped that the withdrawal would bring an end to excessive regulation from Brussels and more sovereignty for British citizens. Well, the conclusion is sobering, though. Brexit has not freed British citizens from overreaching bureaucrats. Instead, it has replaced bureaucrats from Brussels with bureaucracy from London. Welcome to the Brexit, sir. A comprehensive reduction in regulations did not take place after Brexit, and that was said by the economist Gern from the IFW. Instead, over the last 4 years, many EU rules have simply been incorporated into British law. And the British rules are often even stricter than necessary according to EU standards. So homemade again. And Westminster veteran Davies also sees it that way. The EU was a welcome scapegoat for everything. Whenever British politicians wanted to do something unpopular, they could pretend that the EU was forcing them. The biggest problem for trade and economic cooperation is no longer tariffs, but incompatible regulations. As a result of Brexit, this form of uncertainty and bureaucracy has increased again, because two different regulatory frameworks have to be reconciled. And the most recent example is, in February, the British government introduced far-reaching additional rules for the import of food from the EU. Producers and exporters of many plant and animal products in the EU must now include health certificates with their shipments. And from the end of April 24, there will also be physical checks at the border. In this way, London wants to ensure that imports do not pose any health risks. And the conclusion is, trade between the island and the mainland has not collapsed, of course, but Britain's export boom is still a long time coming, and the bureaucracy is alive. And some institutions in Great Britain enjoy an almost mystical reputation across party lines. The royal family is one of them, the national team, the Three Lions, and of course, Tea. And also at the forefront, the National Health Service, the NHS. Founded in 1948, the United Kingdom was one of the first countries in the world to provide a system that guarantees healthcare to every person in the kingdom, not financed by individual contributions, but mainly by tax money. And the Brexiteers used the NHS myth to argue against the EU. They promised that £350 million a week should be put into the NHS instead of the EU. And even back then, it was criticized because too little money, too few staff. And the NHS needs to be optimized for an aging society. But what happened to the Brexiteers' promise? In October 2023, Michael Gove, a minister in Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's cabinet, and one of the key Conservatives' behind the Brexit campaign, he said, "Now there's more than £350 million for our NHS. Promise made, promise delivered." Well, where the Conservative Party got these numbers, that remains a secret. Because there's no evidence that more money is actually flowing. Nobody in the kingdom really believed that the promise would be kept. And even was a fake promise. But even Nigel Farage, one of the faces of the EU critical leave campaign, is now ashamed of the £350 million promise. He says this promise was a mistake. And today the NHS is in worse shape than ever before in history. And the numbers show something shocking. Almost half of all emergency room patients have to wait more than 4 hours to be treated. The average waiting time for treatment in an emergency such as a stroke or heart attack has now increased to more than 70 minutes. And at the end of 2022, 7.2 million patients were waiting for non-acute treatment such as cancer therapy or hip or knee replacement. And nursing staff are now striking so frequently that officials have to warn the public to avoid high-risk activities. And the conclusion is, the NHS was dysfunctional long before Brexit, but nothing has improved as a result of Brexit. And another big promise of the Brexit supporters was a stricter border regime. Brexit promised less migration from EU countries and a higher level of qualifications for migrant workers. Well, the British government has kinda kept this promise. Brexit is working here. In the year of the Brexit referendum, the number of migrants from the EU reached a high of 250,000. After that, the number dropped enormously. In 2022, more people left Great Britain for the EU than came into the country from there. And the British government has managed to end the flow of migrant workers, particularly from Eastern Europe. The level of qualifications has also increased significantly, says economist Gern. And the London political expert Davies also recognizes that the number of EU migrants has declined. At the same time, migrants from the EU were simply replaced by more well-educated migrants from other countries, he says. But there's also a downside. The migration restrictions for low-skilled people come at a price. Highly qualified immigrants do not want to do nursing, waitresses, or work in construction. It is precisely these workers that are missing from the British economy. The Centre for European Reform found last year that post-Brexit rules had led to a shortage of 330,000 workers, and particularly affected are the healthcare system, the gastronomy, and construction. And even Tim Martin, the legendary owner of the cheap pub chain Wetherspoons and a colourful supporter of Brexit, regularly speaks out critically and calls for a smart, more liberal migration system. Otherwise, he will run out of staff. But the conclusion is migration is under control. But no migration is not a solution, not even for the lower income groups. The economic collapse predicted by Brexit opponents has not materialized, of course, but there is currently no boom in sight either. On the contrary, economist Gern states that the loss of growth since 2016 is mostly estimated at 3 to 6%, with a significant part occurring before the actual exit from the EU. The kingdom's weak growth is also the result of the unkept promises of the Brexiteers. The lower house will be re-elected this year, and time is running out for current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to convince his compatriots of the benefits of Brexit. He himself voted for the exit at the time. And 4 years after leaving the EU, some Brits have a new vocabulary in their a new word in their vocabulary, and that's regret. That's the mixture of Brexit and regret. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.